In this video, I want to talk about the appropriate role that the courts play in our system. It's important to keep in mind that the courts are unique in that they are the only branch of government that isn't really elected by the people. Now, they get their jobs by being nominated by people who are elected, and then they are confirmed by the Senate, and the senators are elected, right? And so I'm not saying that there's no connection between what citizens want and the courts, but the thing is that once they get elected, they serve for life. So if a member of Congress does something that people disagree with, they can vote him out of office, right? If a president does something that people don't like, they can vote him out of office. But in the case of a judge, once a judge gets their job, they're there for life, or until they resign or die, retire, or in extreme cases, because it doesn't happen very often, when they're impeached and removed. So this is what makes it such an unusual institution in a democracy, because there's no democratic accountability per se. With that in mind, depending on people's views and ideology, they have very different interpretations about how they go about being judges. There's a group of people that we refer to as strict constructionists and a group that we call loose constructionists. I don't particularly like that terminology, but that's what everybody uses. And so I'm going to use it in my lecture as well. So if you decide to take another political science course, you'll know what it means. Also, sometimes strict constructionists are referred to as textualists, right? So there are other words for it, but you'll see the difference between the two groups. For people who are strict constructionists, judges, this is how they think that a judge should go about making a decision in a case. That if a judge is confronted, let's say with a case having to do with freedom of speech, the example I've used previously, and let's say, again, in the previous example, there was a law that a person violated, and they were arrested, and they argued that the law that was used to arrest them violated their freedom of speech, their First Amendment rights. Okay, so that's the framework of the case. A strict constructionist would say, here's how a judge should go about making a decision in a case like this. This is the proper criteria for them to use. First, they should obviously know what the law actually says and what it does. So the law in question is something that should be examined. And they should measure that against the intentions of the framers when they wrote the Constitution of the United States. What did the framers intend when they crafted the First Amendment? And they just don't have to go by the Constitution itself, although you'll see in a moment that's very important, because we have all kinds of written recordings of what happened at the Constitutional Convention. We have, there's records of the debate. As a matter of fact, James Madison took important notes on the debate. There are drafts of the Constitution that were later modified. And so there's all kinds of historical records about what was actually said at the Constitutional Convention. And so the first thing that a strict constructionist would say is you need to find out what the framers intended when they crafted the First Amendment in our example. What did the framers of the Constitution mean and intend to do with this part of the Constitution? And then the second thing they say is that what judges should do is do a literal reading of the Constitution. What do the words in the Constitution actually say? Like, we know about all the debate, We have a history of the debate. We know what the things that were discussed. But when it came down to it and they had to put words down, what does the Constitution actually say? Because that winds up being the key. What does it actually say? Now, it's, there's interpretation involved in the Constitution, and the Constitution is somewhat vague sometimes. So there is room for interpretation. But for the strict construction, it should be a very narrow interpretation. Okay? A loose constructionist, a judge, would have a different way of approaching the case. Now, first, a loose constructionist would say, yes, you need to know the law and what the law that this person is claiming violated their First Amendment rights. You need to know what the law actually says. And again, like a strict constructionist, it's important to understand what the intentions of the framers were when they wrote the First Amendment. Right? What was said at the Constitutional Convention? What words did they finally write? But then a loose constructionist will bring in one more element to it. They would say it's all fine and dandy to know what the framers thought, what the framers intended, but in making a decision in 2020, right, or 22, or in the 1900s or the 2000s, that a judge should also acknowledge that there have been changes in society, changes in the government, changes in the way the economy runs, changes in social values. And so a loose constructionist would say you have to take the insights of the framers and what they intended to do. You have to take the words of the Constitution themselves and what they say, and then you also have to keep in mind that we're in a different world than the framers were in. As we'll talk about in terms of the issue of privacy a little bit later. What privacy meant at the time of the writing of the Constitution in the 1700s and what privacy means now are like completely different things. There was no internet, right, when the framers were writing the Constitution. The kinds of technology and the ways in which our privacy could be sort of compromised wasn't even in their mind. They couldn't imagine what this world was like. And so the framers would say, and back then, they had slaves. Women couldn't vote. Only people with property could vote. The economy was organized very differently. The United States was this agrarian power with mostly farms. Now we're an industrial superpower. Social values have changed tremendously from back then to now. Right, so much has changed. A loose constructionist would say you have to take that into account. And so there are two very different ways of thinking about the Constitution. The way the strict constructionists would look at it, it's a more narrow, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but a more narrow kind of limited reading of the Constitution and what the framers intended. And the loose constructionists, while they rely on the same information as strict constructionists, they also think judges should take into account how different our world is from the world that when the Constitution was written. And I'm not going to tell you whether you should be a strict constructionist or a loose constructionist, who you think is right, but this is the difference that judges have when they approach cases because of the way they think about their role as judges. Now, generally speaking, this is not always true, but generally speaking, strict constructionism is associated with conservatism. So Republicans are more likely to be strict constructionists. Loose constructionism is generally voted with a more liberal ideology. So judges that were nominated by Democrats tend to be loose constructionists. And there's a whole bunch of people in the middle. So I don't want to downplay that. But on the extreme ends of this debate, we have I'm trying to get my hands go. We have the strict constructionists on one end, the loose constructionists on the other end. And so it's important to understand that distinction as we move into the next video, because what I'm going to talk about next is a question of privacy. Do citizens have a right to privacy? And once again, as I've been saying throughout this lecture, these lecture videos, it's May 2022, and the Supreme Court in June, so in a month from today, is going to be issuing a ruling about Roe versus Wade. Roe versus Wade, although it's a technically, or what some people say it would be it's a court case having to do with abortion. Actually, that's not true. It's a court case having to do with privacy, and I'll be explaining that over the next few videos. But as you get ready to go to the next video, think about the question: do citizens have a right to privacy? And how would a strict constructionist approach that versus how would a loose constructionist approach that question? Because that's what I'll be taking up in the next video.